Earlier this year, because not enough people were playing them, Pokemon Showdown removed many of the ladders for playable BDSP format. Some formats in Smogon's tiering system were getting fewer than 1,000 games played per month. BDSP OU, which is standard play for BDSP, received around 50,000 games last month, which is a stark drop-off from the 500,000 games per month around November 2021, which is when BDSP was released. The BDSP VGC scene barely existed too. Now obviously all games start with a lot of hype, so to see a decline from day one is not the most alarming thing in the world. That's what normally happens. But the drop-off here was huge by any metric, and by many accounts, competitive BDSP did not live up to expectations. So what happened? But before we continue, make sure to subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything and helps out the channel a lot. We're on the road to 100k subscribers. The fundamental issue is that Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were treated more as spin-off games than full-fledged remakes. Competitive BDSP did not live up to expectations because BDSP itself did not live up to expectations. Pokemon Leaf Green and Fire Red, remakes of the original Red and Blue, were influential in competitive Generation 3 Pokemon. Similarly, Heart Gold and Soul Silver were important for competitive Generation 4 Pokemon. The Hoenn remakes, Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, were huge for competitive Gen 6 Pokemon, and Gen 6 Pokemon can itself be divided into the X and Y era and the ORAS era. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl did not continue that trend. BDSP was treated more like Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu than Pokemon Alpha Ruby. As a design choice, it was intentionally an isolated game rather than an extension of Generation 8. The first main casualty of the strategic decision was Pokemon Home, an app that lets you transfer Pokemon in between games. A lot of Pokemon in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl don't have access to a lot of their good moves. For example, Weavile doesn't get Knockoff, and most famously, Zapdos doesn't get Heat Wave or Hurricane. The frustration of these move pool issues are similar to the frustrations you might have while playing some of the older generation games. The best example is Shiftry in Generation 3 when you find out it doesn't get a good Grass or Dark type move. Ordinarily, Pokemon Home would fix move pool issues because you could simply transfer your old Pokemon to the new game. But Pokemon Home for BDSP won't let you transfer old moves. If you transfer a Pokemon that has moves it shouldn't have, it gets replaced by a level up move, effectively blocking you from editing a Pokemon's BDSP move pool. This is to an extent understandable though. Some move combinations are incredibly rare in-game and would require elaborate transfer sequences from games and events that are over 15 years old. For example, Wish Chansey was only available at a 2004 in real life event in New York and can be transferred over to Pokemon Sword and Shield. There are many move combinations that are unrealistic to have now on the actual games, and making a decision to try and remove the barrier to entry is not the worst thing in the world. In BDSP, because of the transfer restrictions, you do not have to compete with people who would have had access to their 2004 Wish Chansey. Unfortunately though, it did have the side effect of gutting the move pool for a lot of Pokemon. An alternative, for example, would have been to give Pokemon access to their old move pool inherently in the game, but figuring out how to incorporate that might have been tough. How could you give every Pokemon every move they've ever had? Would it be Battle Tower points or maybe something different? There's also signs that they wanted to intentionally cut down the move pool anyway. For example, the Toxic TM does exist in the game, but Pokemon like Heatran and Tentacruel can't use it anymore. There's no technical limitation for that, it had to have been a design choice. Similarly, as a design decision, only items from the original Gen 4 are allowed in the game. That means no Eviolite or Assault Vest. Overall, the game felt a little incomplete. Also, this is not related to anything competitive Pokemon, but I did think it was funny how Volkner can have a Heat Wave Hurricane Zapdos even though it's impossible for the player. They clearly knew about the move pool limitations they were implementing, so it was a decision, not an oversight, to remove it. There's also the competition with the original Gen 4. If you really wanted to play Gen 4, you could play in the actual Gen 4 competitive scene, which still has an active community. This is relevant for two reasons. The first reason is about tournaments itself. If you wanted to play Generation 4, you could play DPP, which is still featured in Smogon tournaments because it was a main format at one point. Why play BDSP, a spin-off games format? Also, there were metagame reasons too. At the beginning of a format, there tends to be a lot of overpowered Pokemon that needs to be banned. DPP already went through that process 15 years ago, so a lot of the overpowered Pokemon are already banned. BDSP had to take time to ban a lot of the overpowered Pokemon. You couldn't just copy the ban list from DPP because there were enough changes to the metagame. For example, Gengar, for being overpowered, had to be banned in BDSP because there was no pursuit. While some people liked playing in an unbalanced metagame and using the most overpowered Pokemon, after all, enjoyment is subjective, a lot of people didn't. People tend to not want to fight overpowered Pokemon all the time, and people do prefer some stability, as it's called. There were also naturally more learning resources for DPP, considering that people have been playing it for over a decade. There's a slightly larger barrier to entry to play BDSP, and it didn't help that BDSP analyses on Smogon were delayed because people didn't want to waste their time writing analyses that would get obsoleted by Pokemon Home, which ultimately never happened. The original DPP was just a more developed metagame, and when you have the choice, it's hard to justify picking BDSP. The difference between Brilliant Diamond and, for example, Alpha Ruby is that Alpha Ruby wasn't competing with Ruby. It was part of the fabric of Gen 6 itself, and it wasn't an isolated game. If you wanted to, you would have been picking between Gen 3 and Gen 6 as a whole. But to be honest, none of these mechanical issues are game-breaking. Not having moves can be annoying, but you can get over it. A lot of overpowered Pokemon early, you can play through that. If BDSP was designated as the main format, people would have played it. But it wasn't. Competitively, Sword and Shield was still the main format. VGC, which is the official's double format, and is the format that presumably the Pokemon Company cares the most about, did not have any events in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, and their circuit was still played in Sword and Shield even after BDSP was released. The infrastructure was chosen not to exist and to not promote or feature Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. That link, or rather the lack thereof, is the biggest factor. There was effectively little to no support for competitive play. If you expected an Omega Ruby, Alpha Sapphire type game that added new toys to an already vibrant competitive scene, you didn't get it. There was really no reason to play BDSP at all. You could try out the metagame for a little while, but once the new toy syndrome goes away, there's really nothing to keep you playing BDSP. It was fundamentally the same gameplay as Sword and Shield, just with fewer and slightly different Pokemon and smaller move pools. Competitive BDSP failed because it wasn't meant to succeed. It was a quick throwaway game to put in the middle of Gens 8 and 9. It was not a full-fledged remake, and it definitely wasn't on the tier of the Gen 1, Gen 2, or Gen 3 remakes. It was a Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee of the Sinnoh region, and it was treated like the Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee of the Sinnoh region. That's about it. BDSP as a whole didn't live up to expectations, and competitive BDSP is included in that. Thank you for watching, and let me know down in the comments below what you would change about Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl.